Okay, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're joining us from. Thank you very much for joining us in this event, in the second in the 2023 series of Tax Justice Network events. That broad series is titled Early Sightings of a New Tax Justice Era, and the optimism contained in that is largely about what we're going to discuss today, which is the process of moving towards a UN tax convention. So what we're looking at is the process that really began last year with a resolution that passed at the UN General Assembly by unanimous consensus. So every United Nations member state agreeing to begin intergovernmental discussions on the possibility of an international tax cooperation framework under UN auspices. Now, that resolution also gave a mandate to the Secretary-General, Antonio Guterres, to produce a report looking at the options. That report was published in August and scheduled a debate at the General Assembly held last week to debate the Secretary-General's report to consider those options. Now, we heard from a range of high-level speakers in that event, and the moderator, the chair of the G24 group of intergovernmental group, actually concluded the debate by suggesting that a consensus was emerging around option 2 from the Secretary-General's report. And this is the option that has broad support across civil society, and it appears in the G77 group also. And this is the option of a framework convention on tax, which has the possibility both to create individual protocols to put in place globally inclusive rules and standards, but also of creating a convention body for the future negotiation of tax rules. And I think the reason why there is this emerging support for option 2 is, in a sense, it's the option that doesn't close any doors before negotiations begin. So it leaves the possibility both of binding protocols, but also the creation of a UN tax body intact for countries then to negotiate. What we're looking forward to now is the possibility of the next resolution, which could begin those negotiations formally and perhaps begin to set a schedule. And that's what we'll be discussing today. The context of that, of course, is, per the state of tax justice estimates, countries around the world lose something like $480 billion a year. Let's call it around $500 billion to cross-border tax abuse by multinational companies and by individuals hiding their assets and income streams offshore every year. In some countries, that's 10 or 20% of their public health budget. In other countries, it's 50 or even 100%. In some countries, including India, for example, those estimated losses, exceed the public health budget. So we're talking about revenues with the potential to do enormous good if they could be recovered. And of course, the spirit of this convention is very much in line with what was agreed in the Sustainable Development Goals in 2015, which put tax in first place as the primary means of implementation for the entire framework and committed countries to greater international cooperation. Now, 8 years later, halfway through the SDG period, we haven't yet seen that international cooperation, and this convention process is really the beginning of it. But there's a long road to go. What we're going to do today is hear from a set of experts from all around the world who've engaged in this process in different ways, some directly in the work of the UN, others from the civil society side, or analysing from academia, or in the case of Dr. Valdez, from the Colombian government, which has been an important player so far in this process. So I'll introduce the speakers. We'll hear from each of them, and then we'll go into a discussion session followed by a Q&A. Let me ask the audience let me point out two things. The first that we have interpretation, so you'll find that at the bottom of your Zoom screen. This is available in French, Spanish, Portuguese, and English. And secondly, if you'd like to put questions for us to look at in the Q&A, then that's also available from the bottom of your screen, and we'll try and get through as many of those questions as we can. Okay, let me move to the introductions because we do have a really fantastic panel today to consider this. So we'll hear first from Mr. Naveed Hanif, who is the Assistant Secretary-General of UNDESA, the United Nations Department of Economic and Social Affairs. Now, Naveed has been involved in UN processes in all sorts of areas over the last 20 years, but including with DESA and positions in ECOSOC. So he's absolutely embedded in the financing for development process. And of course, DESA provided the staff to support the Secretary General's report. And so we can hear very directly about the process of producing that report, its the options that it sets out, and where perhaps we go from here in terms of the next steps that were identified. Next, we'll hear from Dr. Maria Fernandez Valdez, who's the Deputy Minister of Finance for Colombia. Now, Dr. Valdez has worked on tax, particularly tax and inequality. Indeed, has a book, a very good book on that very subject. After studying in Colombia, in the Netherlands, in Germany, working for the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung, and now holding this important post in government. And of course, it's Colombia that hosted, with the co-lead of Brazil and Chile, the Cartagena process, including a summit a couple of months ago, to bring together regional discussions across Latin America and the Caribbean on just these issues, policies to curb tax abuse within the region, and the possibility of a common position in United Nations discussions. Then we'll hear from Dr. Leila Latif, who's a lawyer based in Kenya, who studied and worked in the UK, also a very significant figure in the Committee for Fiscal Studies at the University of Nairobi, and also we are delighted to recognise a non-executive director of the Tax Justice Network. And Dr. Latif has worked on a set of pieces of work in this area, including supporting important African policy processes around the emerging common African position, recognising that Africa as a group has led this process both at the UN and in terms of regional coordination, going back to the high-level panel on illicit financial flows out of Africa, chaired by former South African President Thabo Mbeki from the early 2010s. Now, last but not least, we'll hear from Tove Reiding, who's the Policy and Advocacy Manager at Eurodad, and also one of the elected regional representatives of Tax Justice Europe within the Global Alliance for Tax Justice, which is the umbrella body for mass mobilization organizations all around the world on this issue. Tove is also the author of a draft text for a UN tax convention. And if you haven't read that, I really recommend that as a kind of both a very exciting document itself, also a very good way to get a sense of the kind of the set of options that we're really looking at when we talk about a UN tax convention. And I'm sure Tove will speak to that when she speaks. Okay, enough from me. I remind you again once more about the interpretation, and I'll introduce now and hand over to our first speaker, Mr. Naveed Hanif, the Assistant Secretary-General of UNDESA. Naveed, we're delighted to have you here, having led this process, and really interested to hear your thoughts on, the Secretary-General's report and the debate last week, and where perhaps we can go from here. So over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and greetings to everyone. And I'm honored to join this distinguished panel. But also let me congratulate Tax Justice Network for your 20th anniversary and your outstanding contribution to this work so far. And Alex, personally, your commitment and your drive to advance ideas which can bring greater equity and fairness to the tax system globally. Let me focus my presentation in 3 parts, basically. First and foremost, the context. We cannot discuss this issue in a vacuum. Where are we in terms of the Sustainable Development Goals, illicit financial flows, and our efforts to mobilize resources for both climate action and sustainable development agenda. The summit that was held last week here, both Climate Action Summit and the SDG Summit, both had message of hope and determination, but the overall assessment was very sobering. We are lagging far behind on the Sustainable Development Goals, actually going in reverse in some areas. And also, climate action, we are falling short of the agreements made in Paris. So the issue of resource mobilization was at the center of all these conversations. And the conversation on tax, especially effective international tax cooperation, can significantly enhance our efforts to fight illicit financial flows, increase domestic resource mobilization, which is key for investing in the SDGs. Then let me come to the high-level dialogue on financing for development. And Alex, you mentioned the statement by G24. I would say the message was unambiguously clear. They would like to move global tax cooperation, which is more inclusive, rather fully inclusive and more effective. So these were the key words in the resolution that was adopted last year by the General Assembly. And that's where the Secretary General's report came out in response to that resolution. And before I get to the report, let me also mention this debate is a debate about taxing rights, tax sovereignty of countries. And that's why it becomes even more important. It's not just resources, it's not just equity and fairness, it's also a question of letting sovereign states exercise their rights. So what is the report? How did we conceive the report, and what is the report offering? And I will then mention the next steps quickly. You know, the SC wanted to be very open and transparent, so we sought inputs from all over the world and from all stakeholders, and I want to thank civil society and activists who contributed in a very meaningful manner. But we received 80 inputs, 80 points of views. And those really enriched our work. So if we apply the 2 criteria in the resolution, fully inclusive and more effective, the report comes to the conclusion nothing, neither the UN Tax Committee nor the OECD and other jurisdictions or entities working on this fully meets the benchmarks of inclusiveness and effectiveness, both on substance and on process. So that's where the report, I think, because of the resolution's content and the 80 inputs we received, breaks new ground. It doesn't acknowledge anything that's going on which would fulfill this criteria. If these criteria cannot be met, what to do? Report comes up with the conclusion, and based on evidence and analysis, UN's role in tax norm setting appears to be the most viable path forward to make international tax cooperation fully inclusive and more effective. So we have presented 3 options. One of the option, Alex, you already mentioned in detail. Option 1 is multilateral convention, international tax cooperation. It would be regulatory in nature and set out a potentially broad range of obligations. Second option, which Alex mentioned, is becoming an attractive option for most of the countries, but we will know in October, on 5th of October, when countries will discuss this in detail, and then the resolution that they will negotiate afterwards. Second option is a framework convention, international tax cooperation, that will establish a common objectives and broad commitments, and of course, a conference of the parties regarding international tax cooperation, and then this general system of governance can be complemented by protocols on specific issues. And third option is a framework for international tax cooperation, which is non-binding. It's an agenda for coordinated actions. And I can give you parallels. It looks like the first option is UN Convention Against Corruption. Second option is more like the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. And third option is more like the Sendai Framework on Disaster Risk Reduction. I'm using these analogies to make it easier to understand by those who are not familiar with the UN jargon and processes. Next steps. For option 1 and 2, next steps actually will involve actions at 2 stages. First, which should happen this year, the Assembly could establish a member state-led intergovernmental ad hoc expert advisory group to prepare the draft terms of reference for negotiating a convention. So how do you establish the confidence of the parties, and how do they come together to negotiate? And the second step will be to actually, after the TORs are agreed, to establish a member state-led intergovernmental ad hoc committee to negotiate the convention. And that's a practice we followed on UNCAC, the UN Convention, Anti-Corruption Convention. For the non-legally binding framework, which is the third option, the Assembly could establish a member state-led intergovernmental ad hoc group with a defined time frame. It has a deadline to end its work, and then a high-level subject matter conference with such a framework would be typically emerge from such a conference, and that has happened in the case of many other issues also. So with these 3 options, we have identified the next steps that member states can choose to take. And for the expert group, we don't require more than 12 months to come up with the details, the TORs, but then it requires, I think, longer time period once they decide to start negotiating the framework or other possibilities of coming up with a legally binding or non-legally binding, whatever they decide in terms of the form that legislation should take, that UN will bring. So after identifying these options, we have, of course, been briefing member states, and they are in the process of drafting a resolution which they will be presenting the week of 9th October, after the debate on 5th of October. Then we are here to support them, but I also will call on all experts and activists to continue to help member states in getting greater clarity in what will be the most effective way to proceed to meet the 2 criteria that they've identified in the resolution. Let me end, Alex, by mentioning that once they agree on the option, they will need continuous support in their capacity to make sure that they negotiate these things in a manner that safeguards their interest, that secures their right to tax, and that also enables them to generate the resources they need to invest in sustainable development goals and in climate action. The United Nations, of course, will bolster its capacities even further to support member states in a very meaningful fashion and help them in shaping a regime which addresses the concerns that they have clearly identified in the resolution that they adopted last year. Let me stop here and once again thank you for the opportunity to join all of you.
Thank you very much, Navid, including for your very kind words at the beginning. It's kind of fascinating to hear, and I think there's a set of questions that we'll get into, but we'll go around each of the speakers and then come back with that. I see that Dr. Maria Fernanda Valdez has joined us, the Deputy Minister of Finance of Colombia. Buenos días y muchas gracias por unirse con nosotros. It's a great honor for us to have you with us. I understand that your schedule is very busy, but the chance to hear from the Colombian Ministry of Finance when you've been leading this process of regional cooperation is too good for us to miss. So please let me hand straight over to you for your reflections on this process at the UN, but also the regional process that you're leading. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. So it's a pleasure to be with you today. I'm really happy to meet with former colleagues and friends and discuss the role of the platform for taxation in Latin America and the Caribbean, now known as PTLAC, in Spanish, PETELAC, and to talk about the role of Colombia in all the discussions that are happening in the OECD, but also in the UN. So I would like to start with some words about the PTLAC. As you may know, last July, 2 months ago, 14 countries of Latin America and the Caribbean met in Cartagena, the Indias, to establish this platform, this PTLAC platform, a platform for regional coordination, which has four objectives. The first is to be a platform for sharing experiences and good practices. The second is to help countries build capacities. The third is to produce inputs that could benefit countries in staying informed and taking positions on current tax discussions in the international sphere. We all know here that developing countries do not have always the capacity to digest the large amount of information that comes from international negotiation. So this third objective was intended to close that gap. And the fourth is eventually, and this is the last aim of this space, is to create a unified regional stance on international taxation and somehow to replicate what happens in other regions. We know what happens in Africa, for instance, that countries tend to go with unified positions on those discussions. We don't do the same in Latin America, and we really want this platform to be the start of unified positions for Latin America and the Caribbean. So during this meeting, during this summit, the PTLAC identified priority topics. It was the first decision that it made as a platform was to prioritize topics, 4 topics that we hope we can bring forward and position in international discussions as a region. So the first of the topics was progressivity. The second one was environmental taxation, then digital taxation and tax benefits. For each of those 4 topics, we have requested proposals from civil society and the private sector, so they can bring us the proposals before October 9th. Once we agree on the final proposals for one of those 4 issues, we hope to take them to discussions at the international stage, either at the OECD or at the UN. We also hope that through this platform, we can have a dialogue between Latin America and other countries of the global South on tax matters that could eventually lead to a unified positions at the United Nations or at the OECD. So our idea is not only to, between us, among us, decide which is our position, but also we talk with other countries and other regions of the Global South, and to go with unified positions as well. So I would like now to talk about Colombia and what is the role of Colombia in all of the discussions that are happening at the moment. First, you also may know that Colombia is a country that is a member of both the OECD and the G27. And we believe that we can definitely lead and represent the Global South in those discussions, ensuring that the shared interests of our countries prevail. I have to say that we recognize the efforts and advances of the inclusive framework discussions at the OECD, but we also are conscious of all the limitations, and we believe that some of the decisions that are being made were not necessarily in the best interest of our countries. One of the reasons why this happened is that many developing countries, as I already said, do not have the capacity to discuss sometimes extremely technical issues on equal grounds. This is actually, as I said, one of the main objectives of PTLAC, to fill that information gap. Now, what is the position of Colombia related to what is happening in the UN? Colombia welcomes the recent report released by the UN last July. We definitely believe this is an important step towards a more equal, transparent, and inclusive international tax system. We are still in the process of analyzing all the options presented, the 3 options presented in the report, and we hope to arrive next month with a unified position, not only with the PTLAC country members. In that sense, as a country that is a member both of the OECD and the G27, we will continue to actively participate in the discussions being held at both stages, the OECD and the UN, with the aim of achieving the best possible outcomes for our countries. So let me finish emphasizing once again the important role of the civil society in those discussions. I know quite well, as a person who has been working on issues of tax justice in Latin America already for years, and we met in those discussions even 10 years ago. I know perfectly well how important organizations and the tax justice network have been in all what is happening in this moment. And for that reason, the government of Colombia is convinced that the active participation of civil society organization in this process is a necessary condition for its success. This is why civil society organizations play a crucial role in the governance of the PTLAC. Once again, thank you for the invitation. I won't be able to stay for the question sessions. I have to attend another important meeting. They're already waiting for me, but I'm at your entire disposal to continue this discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. We really appreciate you making the time, and we look forward to the PTLAC decision on which option to back, which of course we all hope will be option 2. But thank you, and I hope we will continue in touch. So,
thank you, Alex. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you. Let me hand over to Dr. Leila Latif, who, as I mentioned, is, among very many other things, one of our non-executive directors, and has been a key part in building the Committee for Fiscal Studies at the University of Nairobi, which is a key policy research hub for the region. And Leila, I know you've also been involved in a lot of the African policy thinking around the UN Tax Convention and the African leadership within that process. So let me hand over to you and ask you for your reflections on last week's debate and looking ahead to where we go from here, and where perhaps where the African leadership may take us from here.
Thank you. So 20 years of safeguarding tax justice. TGN Alex and team, congratulations, right? I join Mr. Naveed as well to congratulate you on this incredible milestone. So just to get to answering the question, what are my reflections on the UN SG's report? And I'm going to give you my reflections from a tax justice lens, right? Because this lens is what makes the SG's report so fundamental, so critical, so essential from the vantage point of African countries, because it provides us with the authority and decisiveness to chart the way forward for Africa on setting the norms, the rules on international taxation, international tax governance, and cooperation now from the standpoint of knowledge, technical experience, and of data, having reflected on the political and technical asymmetries that put the continent as what I call recipients of tax decisions rather than equal partners and stakeholders in designing international tax norms. So from a tax justice perspective, the UNSG's report provides the platform now for Africa to demand fair, inclusive, equal, and equitable exercise of sovereignty to undo the historical injustices in designing tax allocation rights and framing tax norms without the input of African countries. And this tax design was out in place even before the independence of African countries. So we are in the most exciting phase to see African countries chart the way forward to clean up the fractures of international taxation that has seen illicit financial flows dog the continent, reducing its tax base and pushing the continent to the brink of debt distress, and also seeing artificial shifting of profits to tax havens, further constraining the African tax base. Now, billions have been lost in IFFs from the continent, and this realization was clearly put forth in the Mbeki panel report, which triggered serious political positions to stop illicit financial flows from the continent and protect the continent's revenue base. Now, to leap forward, Africans have taken incredible leadership to counter the colonial, old model, neoliberal, I don't know what else to call the current tax framework. Africa has shown great muscle in wanting to play a significant and heroic role in moving international taxation towards a platform that gives them equal leverage to becoming tax norm setters. And the Africa group must be commended at tabling the seminal resolution at the Second Committee of the UN General Assembly last year. And most importantly, their efforts resulted in the adoption of that resolution. It basically has triggered the UNSG's report, and he has proposed 3 options with which to work from towards setting this consensus. And I think Africa has shown that it can play a central role in assuming leadership to propel, navigate, counsel, and even bolster the forthcoming initiatives, and to take leadership in actually tabling another resolution, probably on what option 2 of the UNSG's report could look like. And I say this because Africa uniquely occupies a central position anyway, being the sole continent to have unified around a shared stance on the issue of illicit financial flows. Furthermore, we also have the FACTI panel report, which builds on the foundation laid by the Mbeki panel's report, expanding its purview beyond regional boundaries to encompass the entire globe. So this was even triggered by the Mbeki report, an African report. And this underlies Africa's global significance in shaping the future landscape of international taxation. So in terms of exploring the possible stance of the Africa group in light of the report, and what may follow out of this, my take is that it should do what it did in tabling the 2022 resolution, which was inspired in part by the Economic Commission of Africa's declaration from the finance ministers earlier in 2022, calling for negotiations on a UN tax convention to begin. So this initiative was supported by the AU, HLP on IFFs, which is the Mbeki panel. So there is already unity and a meeting of minds. So the Africa group should actually take leadership on carving out, I think, the foundational terms for option 2. I say this because it's the option that I also had the Honorable Mbeki mention last week at the General Assembly, but also to critically assess the feasibility of synchronizing substantive protocols with the overarching framework convention. I think that should be the way forward for Africa. Back to you, Alex.
Thanks, Leila, and for your kind words. I mean, I think it's worth reflecting, and we kind of highlight it from time to time, but just how extended and important that process of African leadership has been. Without which we can be absolutely certain we wouldn't have got where we are. And there's, it's over 10 years. It's a whole set of points. And I think, as the minister reflected earlier, there is a desire in other regions to replicate that experience, and build the same kind of common positions to be able to exert the same kind of influence and leadership, which is a testament to its success. But it needs to continue because we're not there yet. On that, let me turn to Tove Riding, the policy and advocacy manager from Eurodad, and also of Tax Justice Europe and the Global Alliance for Tax Justice. Tove, you've been following this process from the beginning, back to the fight for a tax body in Addis in 2015 and before. And you were the author of a draft convention text that really kind of crystallizes, I think, for a lot of us, the possibilities of this process. So, and indeed, we're in New York last week following the debate. So let me hand over to you and ask you to give your reflections on both, in a sense, how far we've come, but also how far we have to go now, because nothing has been won quite yet. Tove.
Thank you so much, Alex. First of all, I really want to join everyone in congratulating TJN for 20 years of diehard fight for tax justice. And I think we can definitely say it's true we have a long way to go, but we would not be here if it hadn't been for TJN. And thanks also for a super timely seminar. I'm very happy to be here, and thanks for the invitation. And yes, where are we at? A very interesting trip to New York last week. It's the picture that we've seen for the last year, which is a really interesting picture, but it's becoming more clear now. Last week, we heard Nigeria take the floor and say they were proud to lead a united Africa on this issue, and that's the first point. Is we've seen that since last year. We have a united Africa. And now, again, we've just heard from the deputy minister from Colombia talk about how the Latin American region is in the process of uniting and have started the work to unite the region, looking to Africa. At the same time, there was another picture coming out last week as well when Mexico took the floor. We had the foreign minister speaking and supporting Africa, supporting the call for a UN tax convention. And this is interesting because it shows something else, is that we actually have a quite deep split in the OECD bloc. And we've seen this on and off for the last year, that the OECD countries have become more and more split on this issue. Already last year, when this issue started coming up, we started seeing splits. We saw Norway abstain from voting when the United States put forward a proposal on the issues, and we started seeing cracks, but those cracks are becoming much deeper now. And it's not as such something that we haven't been anticipating, but we weren't expecting to see it so soon. Because if you look at the dynamics of tax havens, you will actually discover that if you look at what the biggest problems are for OECD countries, you will see that often it's actually tax havens among other OECD countries that are specializing in facilitating tax dodging from OECD countries. Even within the EU, you can actually see that the biggest tax haven problems that some EU member states have is other EU member states. So we've been anticipating at some point, the finance ministries were bound to discover where the money is disappearing off to. And with that in mind, As much as countries can love each other, when they lose billions of dollars, they do tend to get worried, even when it's their best buddies that are causing it. So this split is actually one of the reasons why we find that a UN tax process would be really interesting. And what we foresee as the big change factor is that we could have a progressive alliance of countries that are not tax havens. A progressive alliance that spans across developed and developing countries, across OECD and non-OECD countries. A progressive alliance that sets the global agenda and moves forward. Because if you look at the list of countries that are not tax havens, the list of countries that are just losing out on the current situation, it's a very, very large group of countries, and you have some very, very major players. There are some very, very big countries that are just losing out on the fact that this problem hasn't been solved. Now, one question we get a lot when we talk about the importance of this UN process is, well, if it hasn't been solved at the OECD, what do you expect being different? One of the things that people point out is that, well, you're just going to get exactly the same outcome as in the OECD, and it's always going to be the most powerful countries that control everything. And what we saw last year completely changes that picture and really hammers home the point of why the UN dynamics is different. Last year, we suddenly saw the Africa group in the driving seat. They set the agenda, they pushed it forward, and suddenly there was a global consensus on something we definitely have not had a global consensus on before, namely to start an intergovernmental UN tax process. I would dare say this would never have happened at the OECD. And this is an example of the different dynamic that we see at the United Nations. Definitely not the first time that we've seen that. But this is one of the reasons why UN can bring something to the table that we have not seen at the OECD. There are numerous reasons for that. The first thing is that at the UN, there is an Africa group. They're organized, they're negotiating together for a long time already. There are many different groupings and alliances of countries that are already well established. That's the first point, why we see this dynamic. Secondly, countries are on an equal footing. And this is this cannot be emphasized strongly enough that we have not had this at the OECD. As long as the OECD is leading the process, OECD member states will always be more powerful. There's another reason as well, is that the negotiations at the UN are much more transparent and much more public and accessible, and we are able to see what's going on. This is different from the OECD, where we can't see what governments are saying on behalf of their citizens. Negotiating texts are often secret, and generally it's a very opaque process. At the UN, it's very transparent. And that increases the value of the moral argument. Suddenly, when countries are on webcam, it becomes more difficult to run over, let's say, the Africa group, when the Africa group puts something on the table that is actually fully reasonable. So these are some of the reasons why the political dynamics at the UN is very different. And of course, the last very obvious reason is that the OECD inclusive framework, despite the name, was never inclusive. We have over a third of the world's countries that are not at the OECD's inclusive framework, but they are at the United Nations. And if you look at the countries that are missing in the OECD inclusive framework, you will see that it's not the ones we normally call tax havens. They are at the inclusive framework, but it's a lot of countries that actually lose out on the current situation and have an important role to play in setting a better global tax system. In particular, we have an overrepresentation of least developed countries, the poorest countries of the world. One last point on why we need this and what is it that can be done better. We often hear that the OECD are the experts on tax. OECD has the expertise on the OECD tax rules, and these are actually the rules that aren't working. We've been trying to tax corporations with the transfer pricing rules for decades. It's a policy mistake that has caused governments to lose hundreds of billions of dollars. It's been a very, very expensive mistake. And one of the most amazing things about the two review processes that the OECD has been running is that there was never given real consideration to replacing the transfer pricing system. The negotiation was about putting other rules on top, but a fundamental reform of the rules has actually not been considered at the OECD. But it's true, the OECD are the experts on the OECD rules. The UN has the expertise on global agreements and on facilitating global negotiations. The UN also has the expertise on framework conventions. And what we did in the proposal that we tabled for what a UN framework convention on tax could look like was that we went through the examples of UN treaties that already exist, and then we applied that to tax. And then we discovered there's actually a lot that can be gained by using the models that exist on other areas and applying them to tax. Just to give one example, you have on international environmental law, you have the principle that every nation has the sovereign right to decide on the environment and using resources in its own country. And with that right comes the responsibility not to destroy the environment of other countries. So you can apply that to tax, and you can say every country has the sovereign right to control its own tax system and the responsibility not to destroy the tax system of other countries. If you apply that principle, you will see that actually what tax havens are currently doing is not okay. We don't have this principle at the moment. We don't have objectives for what international tax corporations should be doing. We lack very, very basic institutions, including the Conference of the Parties, that can make decisions on global tax rules. So basically, the proposal that we tabled was an example of what problems we could fix on tax if we used the UN's examples from other treaties. And I'm happy to say it became a quite long document because there's actually quite a few problems you can solve if you do that. And the last point to say is the way ahead. Yes, this is politics. And there's not as such any natural laws or physical reasons why countries couldn't solve this process or solve this problem within a year. But we know that at the UN, negotiating framework conventions takes time, and this is going to be a big political step forward. So indeed, I think what Navid mentioned about having a year for the terms of references and then starting the negotiations and probably expecting a longer road ahead, that is indeed the most likely scenario if we get the political will to move forward. If you compare it to the Paris Climate Agreement, the mandate came in Bali and the agreement came in Paris, and that took about 8 years. So, but the timeline depends on the political will, and that's the most important point. We will be moving as fast as our governments allow us to, and our governments will be moving as fast as we pressure them to. And that's where the civil society work to raise this issue with governments is, of course, very, very important. I'm happy to say that this issue is top priority for the Global Alliance for Tax Justice, and we have colleagues around the world that have been campaigning on these issues for years already, but are, of course, extremely excited to see that we're now moving forward. And I think it's safe to say that civil society will be doing the best we can to hold governments to account and to make sure that we move forward as fast as we can. Also keeping in mind that as long as we keep this problem unresolved, we can continue to see our governments lose hundreds of billions of dollars on an annual basis, as TJN has flagged in the State of Tax Justice report that was released this summer. I'm going to keep it at that for now, but very happy to be part of the debate.
Thanks, Tove. And look, I'm about to kind of ask a couple of questions to our speakers and then open up to the Q&A. So let me ask the audience, please, to put in questions, particularly around, you know, the direction of these discussions on a UN tax convention. What do you want to know from this expert panel? Tove there's really kind of kicked the legs out from underneath a couple of the arguments that are often made why, in a sense, why we should try to keep things at the OECD rather than create a framework at the UN. I suppose one thing you might say in defense of the OECD, Tove, is that although they have been the great defenders of arm's length pricing and despite it clearly being unfit for purpose, it's the League of Nations 100 years ago that, you know, that took the decision that we're all stuck with now. So, you know, whether you think the OECD has an inclusive membership, certainly the League of Nations was the club of imperial powers, and it's really their decision that we're all still living with the results of today. But you talked there about not, you know, the OECD being expert in their own tax rules rather than tax rules more generally. I think that the kind of timelines we're talking about also deal with another of the objections that's sometimes been made, which is the idea that we shouldn't have a process at the UN that duplicates what the OECD has been doing. Now, Chennai Mukumba, the Executive Director of Tax Justice Network Africa, said at the General Assembly last week, you know, gave the kind of very clear response to that. The UN process will be globally inclusive, and therefore it does not duplicate or risk duplicating an OECD process that is very much exclusionary. I think that's fair, but it's also true that, you know, to the extent that this process may create a rule-setting body that is globally inclusive and take some of that rule-setting role away from the OECD, it will be several years at best before that's in place. The OECD process is coming to a conclusion, and you know, clearly there's no appetite to try again, given how little is going to be delivered at the OECD. So the duplication point really goes. But there's one point left, and I want to put this to Naveed, and this is that some OECD members have claimed that the UN doesn't have the capacity to host a global tax body of the sort that might result from a framework convention, perhaps. Now, given that your department in DESA hosts the Secretariat for the Tax Committee and also the team that drafted the Secretary-General's report, I wonder how you respond to that suggestion about capacity, whether you see that as a genuine issue or simply not, just a question of resource allocation.
Thank you, Alex. And let me also thank you and, of course, Dr. Laila Latif and Tove for really capturing on some of the aspects which I had left for Q&A, and I did not go into those details. First, at the United Nations, all deliberations, inclusion is a given, universal inclusion is a given, are driven by member states. Secretariat cannot go behind the scenes or convene smaller groups to advance any specific aspects of any issue. So that's the greatest strength. Member states are always in the lead, and they sit on equal terms, so developing countries' voices are heard, and they are better organized. Now, technical capacity. I think we should look at this issue at two levels. First and foremost is the ability of member states, especially developing countries, to convince their tax experts to engage with the UN process. So that capacity among member states to understand the technicalities of taxation and engage their tax administrations and finance ministries in these negotiations. I think that will happen once the member states take a decision. Those parts of the government will come along. Now, our own capacity. As you have seen, In the last 4 or 5 years, we have demonstrated once we get the resources and support from member states, we can deliver. Be it capacity building, be it writing the SG's report with thorough analysis. So once they decide to establish a negotiating process, and once they take this decision by consensus, I'm confident they will also deploy resources. And UN's work is so attractive to so many independent experts and analysts, they are willing to join us. Third, which is the most essential ingredient that UN will bring, we will not just focus on tax in isolation. Let's not forget, tax is part of the larger financing for development conversation. So we inject that perspective, and we will be hosting the Financing for Development conference in a couple of years. So that is critical. Taxation should never be addressed in isolation. And that kind of holistic approach, properly contextualized, only the UN can bring. So our capacities and financing for development have never been questioned. That's why they always come to the UN. 4th conference, UN will lead. So if we didn't have the capacity to deal on financing for development, why would the world gather and convene here? Thank you.
Thank you. That's, I mean, I think kind of both reassuring and inspiring to think of that. Just a follow-up on the last point. I mean, I think last week we heard Spain offer to host the 4th Financing for Development conference and Mexico to co-sponsor. But I didn't, perhaps this was announced, but I didn't pick up if there was a decision on that, or we're expecting a decision during the current session.
We are first of all, Spain offered to host and Mexico indicated to co-host. So they have to discuss with each other, how will that work? Co-hosting is not unusual. It has happened on many occasions before. And there's a division of events that they decide to undertake. We are expecting that this fall, when the committee of the General Assembly starts conversation on this topic, we will have a resolution which will define the modalities, the agenda, largely the focus of the conference, and the venue with dates. So hopefully before the end of the year, we have greater clarity on the Financing for Development 4th conference.
Thank you. So it does feel increasingly like that's a kind of key moment when things might be delivered and the next stage begin, perhaps. I want to ask Leila Latif the next question, and this is, Leila, you talked about the, this long-running. I've just realised that Leila is not with us anymore. That's unfortunate. We must have lost Leila. And I will save my immediate question on where African leadership goes, given some of the pressures, and I'll turn to Europe and Tove. So Tove, you talked about some of the kind of key points around European countries, in that they are among the largest losers in terms of absolute revenue loss to the failures of the current international tax rules, but they're also the majority of OECD members, and in theory at least would have the power to change this. Now, we know that there's kind of at least a couple of things in play there. So one is that, as you said, many of the EU members in the OECD are also major tax havens, particularly corporate tax havens, and so have, at least in a short-sighted way, perhaps have some interest in trying to protect a system that doesn't work from reform. Other EU members, meanwhile, are important headquarters countries, and I think sometimes governments convince themselves or allow themselves to be convinced that what is good for their multinationals in terms of not paying tax elsewhere is somehow good for the country itself, even though the evidence is very firmly against this. In fact, that appears to drive inequalities higher and also to increase the risks even that shareholders face, as well as disempowering workers. But that aside, we know the politics of corporate lobbying. So I guess a question is, if we're hopeful that European countries will become, at least some of them, and perhaps Spain in the context of the Financing for Development conference, that they may become important supporters of the road towards a UN tax convention. Are we kidding ourselves, given that we haven't really seen that dynamic at the OECD? Or is there a basis for genuinely feeling at least some optimism that could be where things start to shift to now?
Thank you so much, Alex. Yeah, building on what Navid said, there is a very important point in the member state-led process. And this is very, very important for the UN process. You will also see it mentioned in the resolution that the Africa Group tabled last year. And what this entails is that the member states organize themselves in alliances and pressure each other directly. And this is quite different from what we've been seeing at the OECD, which is relatively secretariat-led. The negotiating texts often come from the secretariat, and basically you can say that the secretariat plays a much more politically active role than we see at the UN. One of the problems of that is that sometimes when the result is then done, it looks like the secretariat is the only one that really has ownership of the outcome. But it also means that you can't really utilize this pressure between the different blocks of countries to push forward. And one of the reasons we're very keen to have that dynamic on tax, the progressive alliances, is because if you list, and of course, there's some discussion about which countries are tax havens and not, but if you list all the tax havens and then you list all the loser countries, there are very, very big countries on the loser list, and the loser list is much longer than the tax haven list. And this is the kind of dynamics that could be extremely important in solving the problem. Before working on tax, I followed the climate negotiations very closely. And you see the same on highly polluting countries. It can be oil countries, for example. You see that the progressive alliances can be used to help countries solve problems within their own region. For example, the EU, I would argue, has benefited greatly from the international alliances to pressure certain countries in Europe that have very large carbon footprints to move forward. I don't think the EU on its own could have achieved the same progress when it comes to climate ambition if it hadn't been for the international alliances. So if the EU is to solve its own tax haven problem, it's actually going to benefit the EU member states that are not tax havens, that they can have some international friends and be part of something bigger. And in terms of the headquarter countries, of course, the reason why this problem goes back to the League of Nations, the reason why we have seen the international discussions move forward so slowly is exactly because of the question, how do you divide the profits of corporations? Should you give the profits to the headquarter countries to tax, or is it for the countries where the money was generated, but there's no headquarter? And this discussion, this is going to be the big splitting of the pie that needs to happen at the UN now. But the funny situation is that because the headquarter countries and the source countries couldn't agree on how to split the pie, they both lost it. It ended up in tax havens because there's no solid international system. So now both factors actually have an interest in coming together and looking at splitting the pie again and working together on stopping tax havens. But yes, we will also see the corporations lobby the governments where they are headquartered to support them in various ways. And this is where there's another factor that becomes interesting. which is that business is not necessarily black and white against a UN tax process. We actually saw that last week in New York when the International Chamber of Commerce took the floor. And what they said was they want tax certainty. They want governments to stop fighting about this issue. And there's actually a fair ask at the base of that point, which is business is super tired of seeing chaos on international taxation. You have new tax rules, then you have countries that do their own thing and unilateral measures. And sometimes you even have countries that tend to try and solve things that happened 20 years ago, such as the state aid cases that we have seen at the EU. So this complete uncertainty actually makes it very unclear how much a corporation will pay in tax in the countries where they operate. And they are tired of that. And the OECD negotiations have failed to get a global peace agreement on tax. That's very clear. They've failed. In fact, they haven't even managed to get the OECD countries on the same page. So this chaos that comes with the OECD negotiations is actually something that business is tired of as well. I'm not saying that we will have the same positions as business in the global tax negotiations, but on this point in particular, even headquarter countries might get lobbied by their corporations on the point of asking for some sort of, finally, some sort of clarity on what the global tax system should look like.
Thanks, Tove. And that actually answers one of the questions in the Q&A on kind of the views of business. I think it's probably worth us all thinking about, the second BEPS process that began in 2019 really got there because of the lobbying of US multinationals to get the US to go back to the table because they were afraid of the number of digital sales taxes, DSTs, that were starting to appear around the world. Now, the potential for, given the effective kind of collapse of ambition of the OECD proposals now, even though they'll still be rolled out, some of them in some countries, at least in the EU, I guess, perhaps not very much elsewhere. Pillar 1 seems to be done, but the minimum tax will come in the EU at least, I guess. But then we're going to see this explosion again, or even more so probably, of unilateral measures because the OECD hasn't delivered and just doesn't provide an attractive option for most countries. And that won't just be DSTs, it will be all sorts of alternative and minimum taxes and approaches to protect tax bases, which is exactly what countries should be doing. Incidentally, we have some proposals coming on this. But the impact for multinationals, I think if you're one of the multinationals that lobbied the US to fix this at the OECD in 2019, you've probably got your head in your hands now thinking, wow, how many years? And look, even Canada has given up on this and is introducing a DST as well. So I think the road back to headquarters countries coming to the table may actually be quite short as that process kicks off. But we have another question about kind of how the UN operates that I'd like to put to Naveed. This is a question from Didier Bayens, who says, once the UN reaches an agreement for the majority of states, and it's worth just to emphasize the difference, while the OECD operates, as they say, by consensus, meaning that there is never a vote and there is never any transparency over what positions were taken, and there also isn't, in effect, a serious opportunity to object. The UN process, as Tove said, is completely transparent, and so you see exactly who supports and doesn't, and you have votes. So it is possible to have decisions taken by majority that are not unanimous, although we're currently within unanimity on this process so far. But the question is, once the UN reaches an agreement for the majority of states, how can we involve tax havens? And I would kind of say perhaps there's two elements to that. So one is the sort of tax haven that is not an OECD member, but has very much been a part of the inclusive framework, kind of increasing the numbers of jurisdictions there, many of them UK dependent territories of one type and another. But then there's also the type of tax haven that the two of us talked about, including OECD member states themselves. So I wonder, if you can give us some sense, given your knowledge of UN processes over the years, there isn't always unanimity. And so what would happen in this scenario where we have a majority of states wanting to go forward, but some significant objectors, perhaps both some UN member states and some jurisdictions outside? How would that process develop from there, do you think?
That's a very important question, and I must tell you, my hope is it goes through by consensus. That will be an ideal outcome. Even if it goes through by consensus, we will have to have a clause which will clearly put an onus on the systematically significant countries when it comes to tax havens. Unless they ratify it, the entry into force will not happen. And that's not unusual. In most of the UN conventions, whether on disarmament, on issues of norm setting on internet governance or other issues, we have always ensured that the systematically significant countries have to come into these norms before they are enforced. Otherwise, here is a disadvantage of the first mover. Those who come into the regime and want to abide by it, and those who do not join and stay outside, they become the beneficiaries of not abiding by the regime. So hopefully by consensus, even by consensus, there should be a provision. All systematically significant countries who can have the potential or already tax havens will have ratified the treaty. Or let's 65 to 70% of those will have ratified the treaty. And if you look at Pillar 1 of the OECD, it also has a provision. Unless the US ratifies, it won't come into force. And then the other example, which is not a very good one, which was voted upon. If you look at the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, the UN Convention on Nuclear Test Ban, it has that provision. Unless 62 countries who have the capacity to develop nuclear weapons, unless they ratify, it cannot come into force. So it never came into force. And that's not a very good example to give. But any UN regime which will address this kind of issue will have a clause to make sure that systematically significant countries' majority joins before the entry into force happens.
Just to follow that up, I mean, I suppose there is a concern with Pillar 1 in the OECD process that, when the Biden administration came in, they effectively put a line through what had been discussed up to that point under Pillar 1 and put on the table a proposal from one of their new staff. And that became Pillar 1, although much less ambitious than the previous version. And then we reach this point where the US itself, everyone agrees with a fair bit of grumbling, but everyone agrees because it's the US. And then the US finds it cannot get the measure through its own Congress. And so you have this position where the US has single-handedly determined the shape of Pillar 1 and is now single-handedly responsible for the fact that it's not going to happen. I wonder whether, within a UN setting, that would necessarily be the type of outcome. I mean, so if you think of a major state not supporting, let's say not supporting a resolution to take forward negotiations, would you expect those negotiations to begin with the possibility that a major state joins later or simply stays outside? And I think on tax, you can see how everyone else effectively could protect their tax base while a major country like the US stays outside. But I wonder within the UN, at least perhaps not the laws, but the kind of the common ways of working, whether that would be likely, just in this scenario, if we didn't get absolute unanimity, that things could still go forward in a positive way.
That's a hypothetical question, Alex. We'll have to wait how the situation unfolds. And there have been many situations where they start with this position, and then the stakeholders from their own national jurisdiction, business included, they might show the benefits of engaging. So it also depends how this whole scenario unfolds. And US comes across, they have an open mind, especially the business sector in the US is approaching with an open mind. So let's hope we stay positive and we get an outcome which is beneficial for all stakeholders.
Yeah, no, I think we're all in that that moment of hope, and indeed working to support it. Which takes me to another question that I will direct to Tova. So Maria Ron Balsera from CSR raises a question that, you know, there seems to be broad support on the civil society side, at least, I think significantly wider too, for option 2 from the Secretary-General's report. That's the UN Framework Convention. And so Maria asks, how can we help to ensure that intergovernmental negotiations move towards this this direction? So Tova, I think you might want to reflect on the previous question also, but if you can give us your sense, you know, not least as a leading player in that work yourself, how we can help the negotiations to move towards option 2.
Yes, thank you for a very important question. I think much is already being done. One of the most exciting things is that we have so many civil society colleagues in capitals. And this is an important part of UN negotiations, is that once a negotiator sits and blocks at the UN, if we want that negotiator to move, very often work has to be done in capital to increase the pressure for the government to move forward. So at the same time, the fact that the UN is relatively transparent also means that when a government sits and blocks single-handedly, there's likely to be global attention on the fact that the government is blocking, and from that can come a lot of international pressure as well. So those are the classic reasons how if one country holds out, there will still be progress at the UN level. For example, in the climate negotiations, there are some very, very highly polluting oil countries that have sometimes blocked the negotiations, but have also been pressured to move forward through the international and domestic pressure. But indeed, on the way that consensus happens at the UN versus OECD, I think one of the important problems with the latest round of OECD negotiations, and it's not the first time we've seen what I would call a US first approach. The US introduces something, we've seen this on automatic information exchange and minimum tax, and the US puts a proposal for Pillar 1 on the table, and then the OECD moves after the US. If we look at the UN negotiations, we'll see that one country that often is the last country to join is the US, not least because of the domestic problems with Congress. And so the US has great trouble participating in global agreements in general, which makes the US first approach really, really dangerous, because you have one country that has much more influence on the agreement than everybody else, which is already unfair and a bad way to do it. But if you want to choose one country to give more power than everyone else, don't choose the first country that's likely to walk out the door. And this is something that we've seen now again with the OECD Pillar 1 and Pillar 2. The US had much more influence than everyone else, and was the first one to more or less announce that actually it's unlikely that that agreement is going to be implemented in the US, which leaves everybody else with an agreement that was written by the US, but not followed by the US. And in terms of how to forge the consensus, another important point is that some parts of tax is about multinational corporations. They are sometimes particularly easy to regulate at the global level because they need access to countries That's in the multinational. They need access to other countries. And therein lies a vulnerability. At the end of the day, countries can start imposing withholding taxes on all money leaving their country and make it really, really difficult for multinational corporations to operate. And what we've seen in other UN negotiations is that countries say, well, unless the headquarter country signs on and introduces these global rules for the corporations from their country, then the other countries are going to take defensive measures. So that's actually an area where, believe it or not, it's actually more possible to introduce and enforce rules simply because you have this element that at the end of the day, corporations need access to countries. And in terms of whether the OECD rules can work alongside the UN rules, and whether we could have an OECD-UN combination of governance, I saw these issues be raised, and I just it's come up a bit, but it's true that if an OECD country has an OECD rule that they really like, this one's really good, they can take it to the UN and table it. And if it gets adopted, it's suddenly been adopted by over a third of the world's countries that weren't part of the OECD negotiations. That would not be duplication, that would be progress. The reason why we think that that's probably not going to happen so much is because even OECD countries are looking extremely hesitant when it comes to signing on to Pillar 1 and Pillar 2. And we saw Canada walk out of the latest round of negotiations, as you mentioned, Alex. We've seen the US walk off, but even in the EU, there is a growing acknowledgement of the fact that the minimum tax is a peculiar thing. It's actually not minimum 15%, it's less than that. And there are some rules that creates some very, very serious problems. And actually, the most excitement in introducing the OECD Pillar 2 rules seem to be coming from tax havens such as Switzerland. So there's some very serious problems with the OECD rules that, in our view, makes it a bad idea even for OECD countries to sign on. And because we're seeing so much hesitation, even from OECD countries, I'm not sure it's relevant to discuss how the rest of the world can sign on when the OECD countries seem hesitant. But in theory, if there are OECD rules that they like, they can take them to the UN and have them endorsed. Whereas any institutional setup that would combine OECD and UN, not just a legal nightmare, but also just politically, these are merging these two, I think, would create nothing but complete chaos. And I'm also very happy to see that there are no serious proposals at the moment about trying to merge the UN and OECD processes. From our perspective, the OECD rules and the inclusive framework is a sinking boat. It should be about getting off that thing instead of trying to link the UN to the OECD process. So that's why I think these combo solutions, luckily, no one is looking at that, and there is not a single OECD country that isn't represented at the UN. They're all there, and if you go to the UN, you will even see in the back there is a sign saying OECD. OECD is an observer. OECD can come to the UN and present their ideas and proposals. That's the thing. Everybody's at the table now. But it's very important that we just acknowledge that the OECD was never a global body and shouldn't be setting global tax rules.
Thanks, Tove. Navid, I think you had your hand up quite early on, so please come back on I'm not quite sure which point.
Yeah, it is in the Q&A, repeatedly mentioned, and Tove responded to most of those points very eloquently. But before we end this conversation, let me clarify. This question, please, comes up 3 times in Q&A. UN is not seeking leadership. UN is not campaigning to be the platform to do tax work. Member states have asked us to evaluate in the world what is fully inclusive and more effective on global tax cooperation. We have done very objective analysis based on 80 inputs and our own analytical work, that whatever exists today is neither fully inclusive nor effective to the level where it can help countries to generate the resources they need. So my request to the panel participants, and not my fellow speakers, but who are attending, please apply these two criteria when you're evaluating tax effectiveness. Do not think UN OECD. It's not about two organizations. It's about the criteria defined by the General Assembly that we are trying to meet. Tove very eloquently mentioned co-leadership, combo options. All members of OECD as members of the UN. Why do you want to create combo and co-leadership? UN includes everyone. So and on top of that, they all have equal voice, equal right to vote, and all opportunities open for influencing it and shaping it. So I just want the participants to know, UN is not competing, UN is not seeking. UN is trying to present a proposal which will be universal in participation, objective, fully transparent, and advance goals that the member states agree to advance. Thank you, Alex.
Thank you, Naveed. I think that is a really important clarification. And, we have seen a lot of media coverage framing this as an institutional battle. And perhaps, perhaps in part because of some quite inflammatory statements from people at the OECD, sort of attacking the Secretary-General's report. Even though, as well, I don't have to be diplomatic, so I can say, very clearly, it's evident on any objective analysis that the OECD process is not inclusive and has not been highly effective. And I don't think anyone can bring forward any evidence to the contrary. And the report states that clearly, but without prejudice. It simply states the findings, and the inputs that the Secretary-General received are very clearly in line with that. But I suppose that reaction has kind of led to this being sort of portrayed in the media as a battle between organizations, when actually it is countries of the world, member states of the United Nations, seeking progress. And I suppose there is perhaps a bit of sympathy for the OECD that it's not an organization that was ever designed to be global or indeed to hold transparent, broadly democratic negotiations, and under pressure of member states wanting to move things to the United Nations over 10 plus years, it's tried to do something that it was never really designed for. And perhaps actually for the OECD and their staff, it will be better if this does go ahead fully at the UN and the OECD can go back to being a technical secretariat providing support to its own member states, rather than trying to do something that it isn't. But this is perhaps where we see things over the next couple of years. But I'm aware of the time, and I should wrap up. So I want to thank Naveed and Tove and Dr. Maria Fernanda Valdez from Colombia, and Leila Latif, who unfortunately dropped off and couldn't participate in the Q&A. I think we've got a real understanding of a lot of the dynamics and where things go from here, and we're very grateful to have had all of your expertise here to share with others, and given us certainly a great deal to think about. We are now into a kind of 2-month window of opportunity to see what the next resolution can deliver, and we're kind of calling on people in every country, but especially in OECD members, to engage with your governments, to ask what position they're taking on your behalf. Are they supporting moving into negotiations that offer the potential of curbing the enormous scale of cross-border tax abuse, or are they blocking it for some reason that's as yet really been untested? We have upcoming events here, including, I think, in a month, an event that looks at our 20-year evaluation, looking at really the progress, not just of Tax Justice Network, but thinking about how things have moved for tax justice over the last 20 years. And we very much welcome everyone to join us for that too. And perhaps we'll have a moment there to look at how the kind of progress that's being made in the discussions about the next resolution then too. I am embarrassingly also going to plug my book, which will be out in December, called, it's part of a series, I didn't choose this snappy title, but What Do We Know and What Should We Do About Tax Justice? With Sage Publications, out in December, available for pre-order soon. And I think, unless I've forgotten another event, I think that's all I'm supposed to be plugging. No, sorry, it's not. There's one more thing. It's this. In March 2024, we have the honour of partnering with the World Inequality Lab, the EU Tax Observatory, the Global Alliance for Tax Justice, ICRICT, the Independent Commission for the Reform of International Corporate Taxation, and Tax Justice Europe, thank you, Tova, in a conference really looking at the European angle, thinking about the engagement of European countries and asking how can a UN tax convention address inequality in Europe and beyond. And you will be able to register for that shortly. We'll also have a call for papers out very soon, so we'd welcome researchers and activists submitting proposals for that.
Thank you.
Let me finish. Naveed, thank you so much, really.
Bye.
And we will look forward to following the progress of this. In the meantime, thank you all, and goodbye.
Thank you. It was an honor to join all of you. Bye-bye, Alex.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.